inviting me, and thank you all for coming out. At my day job, I'm a professor in communication and also urban studies over at North Central College, and I taught for 5 hours today. So bear with me if I'm a little bit tired. It's a real pleasure to be talking to a group of Democrats. It's also a real pleasure to be talking to a group of at least a few union members and a sister from the Fox Valley Labor News. I have a real soft spot in my heart for labor media. I myself used to write about labor issues as a journalist, so many years ago. It seems like a lifetime ago. I don't think it's news to anybody in this group that workers and their unions are under attack in this country, and under attack specifically by Republican state legislatures and Republican governors, and in particular, public sector workers and their unions are under attack. And I just want to remind you of some events of recent years to start off with. Back in February of 2011, I'm sure you all remember that month. It's probably burned into your memory. Republican Governor Scott Walker introduced into the Wisconsin State Legislature a bill essentially stripping all public employees in that state of their collective bargaining rights. Immediately there was a response from school teachers, firefighters, even police officers who rallied at the state capitol in Madison, held massive protests, occupied the rotunda, and protest against this proposed legislation. And yet, a month later, it passed, and Walker signed it into law. And then, of course, there was another 6 or 7 months of gathering of signatures to hold a recall election. They were successful in gathering the signatures. They held a recall election. Scott Walker unfortunately won that election, and then just about a year ago, a federal appeals court upheld the constitutionality of this controversial law, so that today, public sector workers in Wisconsin have no union. At around the same time as this anti-union legislation was making its way through the Wisconsin legislature, a similar bill, you may recall this as well, a similar bill, Senate Bill 5, was being signed into law by Republican Governor John Kasich in Ohio. It too would have eliminated collective bargaining for most public employees. Unions in Ohio, especially teachers' unions, and the American Association of University Professors, an organization I belong to, mounted a massive campaign of protest, held teach-ins, speak-outs, managed to organize and gather signatures for a referendum to repeal the new law, and they were successful in this case. And it's really, I think, a good kind of object lesson in how to respond to these kinds of attacks. In November of 2011, over 61% of voters in Ohio voted to overturn this bill that would have basically deprived workers in that state of the right, public sector workers of the right to unionize. Now, more recently, in December of 2012, the Michigan legislature passed a so-called right to work law, backed by the state's conservative governor, Rick Snyder, that prohibits the, quote, forced collection of union dues or fees as a condition of employment. Essentially, it prohibits the collection of fair share dues from employees who benefit from collective bargaining. Again, there were protests not as massive as the protests in Ohio or Wisconsin by any means, but to this day, the law remains on the books, although it is actually, we just learned not too long ago that the Michigan Supreme Court is actually slated to review its constitutionality, so it may, in fact, be struck down as unconstitutional. Now, the question that has to occur to you looking at what's happened, especially to public sector workers here across the Midwest, which used to be the stronghold, right, of organized labor in this country.
Especially Wisconsin.
Especially Wisconsin, especially Michigan, right? Right, Michigan, even more than Wisconsin, where the United Auto Workers were kings. Who is behind this seemingly coordinated assault on the rights and livelihoods of Americans? Teachers, nurses, firefighters, university professors, police officers, and prison guards. Well, one possible candidate is ALEC. How many of you, prior to coming to this event, have heard of ALEC before? Probably everybody in the room. So some of what I'm going to say is going to be old news to you. But the acronym stands for the American Legislative Exchange Council, and a lot of people believe that they are behind, and there's actually a lot of evidence that they created the kind of model legislation that was behind the attack on public sector workers in Ohio, Wisconsin, and Michigan. Who are they? In a nutshell, they are an organization that brings together conservative state legislators and representatives from big business, as well as from conservative think tanks and right-wing foundations, to develop state and, in some cases, local policy, and in particular, to write model legislation of various kinds. The Guardian newspaper, the London Guardian newspaper, said that there's like a dating service that brings together Republican state legislators and corporate lobbyists to write pieces of legislation that then later get introduced and do real damage to people's lives. The group is, and if you go to their website, it's stated pretty clearly, it is dedicated to free markets, limited government, and federalism. And its history kind of can be traced back to the conservative resurgence in the 1970s, which was sort of a backlash against the victories won by the civil rights movement and the labor movement and the women's rights movement in the 1960s. It was founded in 1973 by kind of this arch-conservative activist, Paul Weyrich, was seemingly behind, a name who's seemingly behind all sorts of conservative activism, as a way to advance a right-wing agenda and right-wing policy ideas at a level where so much policy is made, so much important policy is made, namely at the state level. He felt, and in fact, he was really right about this, that since social welfare policy, for example, is set at the state level, criminal laws are all, criminal matters on criminal justice and so forth are all set at the state level, that conservatives should be active and attempting to influence the agenda at the state level. That was where the important action was, that yes, it was important to influence the debate in Washington, but that the states was where the real action was, and that, I think, in fact, he was right? Since that time, since it started out as a small group of conservative state legislators meeting in a hotel to talk about and share ideas back in 1973, it has grown into a fairly powerful, although to most ordinary Americans, unknown political force. Its members include about 1,800 state legislators from around the country, almost all of them Republicans. I think they have a couple of token Democrats.
We have one right here in town, Representative Darrell.
Right, there you go. So they have a couple of token Democrats, but mostly they're Republicans. They have more than 80 congressional representatives, more than a dozen governors or ex-governors, and again, almost all of these legislators are Republicans. The individual members, these individual politicians who are members of ALEC, pay a kind of nominal dues of about $100 a year, and they're often treated to given scholarships to take part in ALEC events and activities, and what these scholarships usually entail is they'll get free flights to wherever the ALEC meetings are taking place, free hotel rooms, free entertainment of various
So
kinds.
Steve, that's an ALEC scholarship?
Yeah, they get what are called scholarships.
I
They
love
pay
that.
$100 a year in dues, but they get scholarships that allow them to fly to their conferences, go to
That's a
task
lovely
force
spin.
meetings, and so forth.
Scholarship.
Its corporate members, and some of the corporate members or names you'll all recognize include Koch Industries, of course, backed by the notorious. This is where you should hiss. The notorious Koch brothers, the libertarian billionaires, Comcast, AT&T, Time Warner, BP, ExxonMobil, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, and State Farm. These corporate members each pay at minimum $10,000 a year in dues, and then they also often contribute over and above that money for the scholarships that go to the legislators, so the legislators can take part in ALEC activities. And it's the main work of the group is that the group is broken into 9 task forces on key policy areas, and they have a mandate or a mission, these task forces, to develop model pieces of legislation that can then be circulated to ALEC members. So they have policy areas like education, tax policy, commerce and economic development, among others. Each of the task forces includes both legislators and private sector members, and each is charged, as I said, with developing model legislation. The thing that's sort of interesting about this, so it's supposed to be a cooperative effort at writing pieces of legislation, but the private sector members, the corporate lobbyists who take part in these task force brainstorming sessions, actually have veto power over the final versions of the model bill, and yet the legislative members do not. Right? So the lobbyists essentially have veto power over the final versions of these model bills. And then once they develop the model legislation, this model legislation is distributed to members and discussed in detail at ALEC's annual conference, which is always a big event, it's always very lavish. And it's always barred to the press, so none of us really gets to know what's going on. Yeah, I want to just give you some quick numbers here. Just trying to see what time it is. All right, yeah. Give you
10
some quick
minutes?
numbers. 10 minutes, all right, great. Although it has a modest budget, only about I think it manages to run on like something like $7 million annually. It does exercise a fair amount of influence. Every year, the ALEC task forces generate about 200 pieces of model legislation, and every year, hundreds of pieces of legislation modeled after ALEC's model bills are introduced into state legislatures around the country. In recent years, ALEC has produced model legislation that aims to dismantle all sorts of protections that we take for granted. Anti-pollution regulations, they've developed model legislation that aims to privatize prisons, that aims to privatize public schools, that aims to eliminate workers' rights that have been taken for granted since the 1930s, right? Since the Wagner Act, and model legislation that aims to lower wages. And I just want to cite a couple of examples of this kind of legislation, and then I will move on because I know that we're short on time. Their quote, Public Employee Freedom Act eliminates collective bargaining for public employees on the grounds that, quote, an employee should be free to contract on their own terms. And versions of this model legislation have been passed in legislatures and introduced into legislatures around the country, and this was the inspiration for the anti-worker legislation that was introduced in Ohio and Wisconsin. Another of the recent bills is called the At-Will Employment Act, and it narrows or eliminates entirely key workers' rights, allowing employers to terminate a worker at will, right, at any time, for any reason, and it also restricts, or it would restrict, an employer's or an employee's right to sue over unlawful termination. Their Living Wage Mandate Preemption Act allows states, would allow states to prevent their cities and counties from setting minimum wages that exceed the state or federal minimum wage. And then their Employee Rights Reform Act would make it more difficult for unions to collect so-called agent fees from the workers they represent in collective bargaining and the administration of employment contracts. And this was the model bill that was the inspiration for the anti-worker legislation that was adopted in Michigan in 2012. I could go on and on and on. Like I said, they developed something like 200 pieces of model legislation every year. Now, some people have argued that people who complain about ALEC, or journalists who have publicized ALEC, are sort of complaining about something that has always happened, or has happened for a long time, right? Conservative politicians have always networked, they've always borrowed ideas from each other, and they've always borrowed ideas and taken inspiration from models suggested by corporate lobbyists. So this is really nothing new, and I think that's certainly true. However, I think ALEC should concern us because it amplifies this process. And it does so in a way that is secret, that is completely unaccountable to the public, and that gives even more influence, I think, to the already influential lobbyists for big business. So here's why, in a nutshell, I think ALEC matters and why we should care about ALEC. Their conferences, task forces, workshops, and social gatherings give lobbyists unprecedented access to legislators. If a lobbyist wants to contact an individual legislator in Springfield or Madison or St. Paul today, right, without the benefit of this umbrella organization, they usually get a few minutes to make their pitch, or maybe at most half an hour. At ALEC's functions, the lobbyists get the undivided attention of thousands of elected officials from much longer periods of time. And they get to interact with legislators behind closed doors, far from the scrutiny of the press. That's the first thing. Second, ALEC's scholarships look a lot to me like laundering of lobbyist money, right? ALEC scholarships for legislators essentially allow corporate interests to funnel money to legislators to pay for their flights, hotels, and meals related to ALEC's events, yet none of this has to be disclosed by the lobbyists as part of a lobbying campaign, as it would have to be disclosed to Jerusalem and other
Steve, do
circumstances.
the legislators have to disclose that
Right.
Do the legislators disclose
I'm
it
not
anyway?
sure whether legislators have to disclose that as a gift. That's a good question. I can look into that.
It would sort of be like an in-kind kind of thing, they should have to list it somewhere.
You would think so. You would think so. But the biggest problem with ALEC, I think, and why I'm really worked up about it, is that it is a 501c3 tax-exempt organization. So it supposedly is a charitable organization like the Boys and Girls Club or your local homeless shelter. And the IRS allows corporations to write off their contributions to ALEC, as tax deductions, right? They are able to write them off their taxes. So, what should we do? This is, I think, an important question. I think there's a number of steps here, and I'm looking at the time.
Take your time.
I got 3 minutes. All right, great. So the first thing is education and consciousness raising. Common Cause, in particular, has been doing a wonderful job of kind of raising people's awareness about ALEC and the influence that it exerts. Bill Moyers has produced a couple of television shows that have aired on PBS called ALEC Exposed that I think really lay bare what this group is doing. I think direct protest can be effective, and also kind of raising the awareness of the general public, and so it has become very common when ALEC has its big annual conference for groups of protesters of various kinds to greet the members with, you know, with signs and.
Was ALEC in Chicago?
They were in Chicago, and there were a number of people out there protesting. I didn't make it out, but I know a number of people.
I did, there were a lot.
There were a lot. I heard there were a lot of people. It didn't get on the news, but
They didn't cover it at all.
It didn't cover it all, but there were a lot of people, and I've seen it.
They filmed it, but they didn't show
They
it.
didn't show it. There's YouTube videos of a lot of the very spirited protests that took place here in Chicago.
Why exactly?
That's a different talk, I think. Why is that? Why didn't they cover it? I think putting pressure on companies that currently contribute to ALEC, that are currently ALEC members, to divest can be very effective. And let me just say that ALEC used the Florida's Stand Your Ground legislation as a model piece of legislation that they sent out to their members around the country.
That's all over now.
And after the Trayvon Martin incident in Florida, Color of Change, you know, civil rights, kind of civil rights activist group, and that puts out a publication, announced a boycott targeting companies that were involved in ALEC or contributed to ALEC, and also encouraging their readers and their members to write letters to the ALEC corporate members saying that they were no longer.
Steve, where can you find that list of corporate members?
You can find it on Common Cause's website,
All right.
and I was going to mention that in a second. They have an ALEC, it was called the United States of ALEC website, and on that website you can find a list of their corporate members. And as a result of the pressure that was brought by Color of Change, Coca-Cola and Amazon both dropped their affiliation. And as far as I know, I think I read an article that suggested that something like 60 of their corporate members had divested because of public pressure. So that's
Pepsi bailed also.
Pepsi bailed also, and I believe Walmart actually bailed, which is kind of unbelievable that they were responded to public pressure in this case. Finally, there are some groups trying to pressure the IRS to change the group's tax status.
That's so bold.
Rather ran it to the NFL.
Yeah.
It's also 501c.
Yeah. So, putting pressure on the IRS to change the group's tax status. Finally, I think the most effective way of counteracting the influence of ALEC is to elect progressive legislators and governors who cannot be bought and who will not be influenced by corporate lobbyists. I have some handouts here I'll pass out, and I guess I'm done.
Oh, fantastic.
All right. One of the handouts is Common Cause's petition to ALEC's corporate sponsors, and you can circulate that around and just send it back or return it to Common Cause.
This same one?
Oh no, and this one is just a really useful little analysis that compares some of the anti-labor legislation that passed or that was introduced in Ohio, Wisconsin, and Arizona to ALEC's model bill, basically proving that ALEC was behind it. So I will pass those around.
I showed this little article to Steve when he first came in. I clipped it from the Daily Herald in this letter to the editor. And it says, in 2006, the Postal Accountability and Enhancement Act was passed. Requires the post office to pre-fund their health care for 75 years, and to do so in 10 years. This amounts to over $5 billion a year that cannot be used for jobs, blah, blah, blah. Where did this legislation come from?
Oh, you got that?
ALEC. Who sponsored the bill? UPS and FedEx. Isn't that just sweet?
Yes,
And
this is
the
our
private
version
sector
of the bill.
providers of mail
kind of
services,
local,
they don't have
state
to
level.
abide by that at all. Just the public one, just the United States Postal Service. So ALEC is around. Max.
I interviewed Kurt Dillard for a recommendation hearing a matter of a couple of weeks ago, and I asked him about his having been Illinois' point man for ALEC for the last 15 years.
15 years.
And he allowed us how, yes, but he was only interested in the corporate aspect of it. It had nothing to do with education.
Oh, it has everything to do with education.
So our friend Mr. Kurt Dillard here in Hinsdale has been the go-to guy for ALEC in the state of Illinois for as long as there's been Naperville Township.
Isn't that interesting? Yeah.
Well, I think Darlene Alex Sanger is also deeply involved.
Yes.
That is his middle name.
question for you. Are there similar organizations that espouse progressive causes that in some way counteract?
Steve, do you hear that question?
Sorry, I'm sorry.
Are there progressive organizations that would do the same thing for our side?
Are there progressive organizations? Yeah, I think there is a progressive equivalent of state level policy group or.
What about the Center for American Progress? Isn't that one?
I'm not sure if they're the same thing. There is a state level equivalent. It just doesn't involve as nearly as many members. First of all, and secondly, I just can't imagine that progressives would buy this sort of the same kind of the ALEC model where you give exclusive access to give lobbyists exclusive access to legislators to pitch their policy ideas. I mean, I think what we have, I know there is an equivalent kind of state level kind of policy exchange involving progressive legislators, but I don't think lobbyists are involved in any way. I think it's, there might be a bill that's introducing an amendment to introduce a progressive income tax at a state. That becomes a model, and then other states can pick it up. But I don't think it's the same. It's the same thing. What makes this so nefarious is that it's this cooperation between lobbyists and legislators that gives lobbyists this exclusive access to them.
For days and days.
I mean, there's nothing wrong with people exchanging ideas, and there's nothing wrong with borrowing models from other states, right? Using model legislation from other states. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think what's problematic is that the way that this is being used to kind of launder money from lobbyists, and the fact that they're claiming this is apolitical and an educational organization, which is ridiculous. It very clearly is political.
I don't know about others, but I believe in fighting fire with fire. And we should be
I know we should learn
doing
from that.
what they do.
Well, yeah. I mean, at a certain level, yes. Well, we should be.
We need Costco on our side. They're a progressive organization. That could equate.
Hey, this might, I'm sort of a little rookie compared to a lot of y'all here, but like, so historically speaking, like 110 years ago, like workers groups didn't succeed because of just violence, and they would get shot and killed by government, militia if they fought back. So we're in an age where that doesn't happen really, and not to get too left versus right, but like some of my friends sort of joke around, but some of these like really right wing ideas, you either gotta be really rich or really stupid to support.
Right.
Now, I do think that
like the Koch brothers.
I generally feel like that the average person, if they really knew the ins and outs, would totally support like what you're saying. Like it would just make sense. But like, how do we? Why? You know what I'm saying? Like, why do a few super rich people? I mean, I get it. They get inside with the legislators, but like, how do we not disseminate that information better to make the average voter realize that this is ridiculous?
Well, I mean, I think it kind of goes back to this question about why weren't the protests at the ALEC
NBC
covered?
is owned by Comcast.
Right. And part of it has to do with, I mean, as somebody who teaches about the media and studies the media and used to be a journalist a long time ago, I mean, I think that it is true that owners and advertisers exert a conservative pressure on news organizations. So that's part of it, that it's very difficult to get the news out through commercial media. That's why we need labor media, like the Postal News, because workers need their own voice, right, in the media. But at the same time, I don't think that's completely. I mean, obviously, the majority of people are being influenced by NBC and CNN and God forbid Fox, and so. We need to try to make use of those channels to get our message out. I think part of ALEC's success, part of why it's been so successful, is that it has stayed out, right, of the public limelight. It has been able for many, many years to avoid the public spotlight. It only really came to people's awareness in the past 4 or 5 years. It's been around since 1973 in some form or another. An incredibly secretive organization that puts together, conservatives and conservative legislators and lobbyists. That's kind of amazing that it's been able to exist kind of underground without anybody knowing it, without any watchdogs paying attention. Now some journalists have gotten interested, so I think it's actually becoming less effective. But the problem is, it's like a hydra. You cut off this head, right? But some other equivalent of ALEC is going to pop up someplace else. It is. It's like whack-a-mole.
I discovered ALEC in 1997. They were the people that were behind the move from a defined benefit pension
Pension
plan to a defined
501,
contribution.
right. So
They were pushing that,
yeah.
and then in 2000, when the market went to hell in a handbasket, that was no longer saleable, and they moved off to other things.
Yeah. No, yeah.
But in the late 90s, they were all over public pensions.
Absolutely.
We were being dummies. We should be in 401s and be rich like everybody else.
They were pushing, vouchers,
Oh,
20 years ago, and very effectively. In some places, they effectively pushed
And they're working
vouchers
both sides of
in
the street.
Wisconsin.
They're working public prisons,
Right.
and they're working mandatory sentences.
Right. No.
So you're not only,
You get a good client base.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of their more successful, I'm glad you mentioned the prisons, one of their more successful pieces of legislation is a piece of legislation to allow the privatization of prisons. And some of their big contributors are, of course, surprisingly, the owners of private prison companies.
Corrections Corporation.
Right, exactly. So,
Hey,
all right, well, thank you
lifted
so
up
much.
a rock for us, you really did.
Thanks so much, and thank you all for